Hello, I am Liz Harlow, a candidate to ordination with Unity Worldwide Ministries. I'm studying with Unity Worldwide Spiritual Institute. An evolving community ministry is forming with me. We are Unity Center of Illumination. Just as the disciples were the foundation, the pillars, the stabilizing, grounding force of a young and evolving ministry, spreading the teachings of Jesus who demonstrated Christ consciousness, just as the disciples were the pillars of the young church. Unity has given us 5 pillars to stand on, to ground into, to uphold and bring into light our evolving community ministry. These 5 pillars are co-founders, the Fillmores. Number 2, integral ministry. Number 3, experiential growth. Number 4, idea, inclusivity, diversity, equity, accessibility. Number 5, evolutionary thinking. Let's look at each of these pillars through the lens of our founders, the Fillmores. Let's look at their writings, the collected works of Charles from his teachings and his sermons, and the body of letters that are Myrtle's ministry. And through this lens, let's also look at our world today, our current ministry, and how these pillars are relevant to us as we come together as a community. The Fillmores. Myrtle Fillmore heard a talk by E.B. Weeks in which he said, "I am a child of God, therefore I do not inherit sickness." Myrtle Fillmore described herself in How to Let God Help You in that collection of letters as a sickly lot. She, at the time, had a death sentence diagnosis of tuberculosis. She heard this statement, "I am a child of God, therefore I do not inherit sickness." And she went into at-one-ment with her body through a process of affirmative prayer and meditation over a 2-year span. She unified her own consciousness with her cellular awareness. She came to know her cells, her organs, her very being as an expression of the divine, and in this demonstrated a full and complete healing from a death sentence diagnosis of tuberculosis, where she was told to get her affairs in order. Her husband observed this truth principle demonstrated. He followed in suit, and thus the movement of silent unity was born. So, looking at our co-founders, what did they bring us primarily? Through their teachings, through their demonstration, and through their lessons, they demonstrated indeed a metaphysical and practical Christianity, what was intended to be a supplemental mystical truth to add to the body of Christ, Christos, that which resides in each of us, the spark of life, Christ, our indwelling life force by which we are illuminated. Our co-founders demonstrated and gave us a deeper metaphysical reflection on the teachings of our master teacher and way shower, Jesus, who demonstrated Christ consciousness. Now, moving into our second pillar, integral ministry. This is where we may grow up, clean up, show up to a mission-centric model of ministry. And I would like to share with you a bit of history of the Fillmores and how they indeed embodied their mission. In the early 1900s, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore taught summer classes in Pueblo and Denver. And in the summer of 1901, they conducted a school, the Colorado Summer School of Metaphysics. Most of these classes were held in a large tent. At night, there were oil lamps burning. In the day, Charles Fillmore, amongst other teachers, would join as orators, demonstrating their lessons. The last classes taught in Colorado were in 1902. By 1909, the head office of Unity was at 917 Tracy Avenue here in Kansas City. How did the Unity Correspondence School come into being? A vision that was part of the mission of the movement of silent unity? Well, in 1909, it was actually upon request of a student of the weekly articles that were being published by Unity. Through this, the student had the confidence to ask, where are the lessons? I want to sign up. Sure enough, a lesson was generated in response to that question. There was an agreement written. The first student was enrolled in Unity Correspondence School. That was in April, and by June of 1909, there were 268 students enrolled. So take a minute to think about in 1909, what it was like for this material to be so enriching, so alive, that students were requesting to be part of these lessons. By 1911, this mission had grown to over 2,000 students over a number of continents. Now, moving forward in time from 1911, the Fillmores resided at the village and built their mission from Unity Village here in Lee Summit in the outskirts of Kansas City. And Charles Fillmore only left for a brief series of lectures in Chicago in 1921 and a short trip to New York in 1926. And he did not leave Unity Village otherwise until after Myrtle passed. So when we stop and consider that time period and how deeply from the covenant letter of Unity, where Charles and Myrtle Fillmore dedicated themselves to the movement, all they had and ever would be, in exchange for abundant resource, we can see that this mission was indeed heart-centered and embodied as they embodied their healings, taught others truth principle, and moved into the world with this mission. 2,000 students by 1911 in 2 years, in that age and time across continents. Let's think about that for a minute. And as we ponder the magnitude of this mission, also in our second pillar, we have shadow work. Shadow work is alive for me, and that I know shadow work to be the cleansing of consciousness in the phase of affirmative prayer. What we classically called the denial, the cleansing in consciousness, the wiping clean of what is not true in our being in order to affirm, to identify with, to bring into our consciousness the divine blueprint, and in the flow, manifest what is in divine order. This shadow work shows up in our second pillar, integral ministry. And this brings me directly into experiential growth, our third pillar, where we harness the power of prayer and meditation, of moving into authentic community, of embodying our spirituality, And as we spoke about shadow work being the cleansing of consciousness in affirmative prayer, when we then move into embodying the divine blueprint and manifesting accordingly in divine order. When we speak about embodying spirituality in this way, let's look to a quote from Myrtle Fillmore and How to Let God Help You. When you first come into a spiritual realization, as you do in the silence, expect it to go down into the depths of your body consciousness and do its powerful and perfect work. None of us has learned to abide in the Christ consciousness continuously, but the times we do rise into it keep us growing and overcoming and establishing more and more of its truth in our lives. So essentially here, Myrtle Fillmore is telling us that we rise into Christ consciousness and demonstrate from that place. And none of us has figured out how to do it continuously, to remain in that state. But the moments that we do, step by step, layer by layer, we establish more and more of the substance of truth in our bodies, our vessels, in our beings. And she speaks of letting this, what we attain to in the silence, move deep into our body consciousness. This is a direct expression of the importance of embodiment. We can only spiritualize the flesh by embodying. This is the passion I hold around our third pillar of experiential growth. That is what we do at Unity Center of Illumination. Now let's move into our fourth pillar, IDEA. This is an acronym for inclusivity, diversity, equity, accessibility. This mode of thinking, how do we set the stage, create the scene? How do we include all who are called to our teachings, our lessons? And when I think about inclusivity, diversity, equity, accessibility, seeing the equity in all of humanity, each individual, and bringing that piece of accessibility so we can find, adhere to, be in that piece of equitable consciousness together. How do we include and diversify in order to expand into the body of Christ? I think about race relations and gender relations. I think about the proclamation in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation that was first intended to free those who were enslaved here in our soil. The race relations piece that led to that, where we were in 1909 as a society. It was only 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation that civil rights were battled for in this nation. There have been many phases of race relations and those issues being very live at the village and in our movement. And let's be real about that. Let's talk about that as part of inclusivity, diversity, equity, accessibility. Let's listen. Let's identify others and listen to what they have to say. Let's venture outside of the frequencies in which we usually think and communicate to understand where others are coming from. I also see a piece of this in gender identity. And I want to relate to Myrtle Fillmore in this piece, in that I had heard that she didn't have a kitchen. She did not have a kitchen in her home. Her mother-in-law was the cook for their family. And it really landed in me. I mean, it almost like tapped me on the cheek when I was at the offices, which are now our records. It's where all of the articles we have in the history of Unity are held. I was in Myrtle's office, and then I went to Charles's office second, and I saw a kitchen in his office, and I understood that his mother had been the cook. And it dawned on me in that moment, when you see Myrtle's letters there, she had a full-time ministry in working with spirit as a facilitator of healing for others, a full-time ministry in writing letters. She took a gender role stance at that time and said, I'm not going to be in the kitchen cooking in the typical mode of what a wife or mother is or has been. My role is in planting this unity movement and this ministry and being a minister to my people. I see this as a huge, very, very quiet, very sovereign, and with character, but a very big gender role proclamation from Myrtle in her lifetime. And so with these issues of economic stability, racial issues, questioning subject matter in our world, very alive, and gender identity and equality emerging in that arena, very live issues in our world now, and they were in the time of our founders as well. So let's learn from the record we have, and let's show up and do what we can. And that brings me from inclusivity, diversity, equity, accessibility into evolutionary thinking. Let's do what we can to evolve the thinking, as we know that substance takes form in the imprint of our thoughts. The thoughts we harness in our being, especially in spiritual practice, become made known through demonstration. So let's continue our evolutionary thinking. This is about developing people. This takes us through all 5 pillars: demonstrating truth principle, integral ministry and shadow work, moving into experiential embodied spirituality, into moving through our world in a diverse, inclusive, equitable way. This is the art of developing people, ourselves as sovereign individuals, and our communities and our ministry. When we think about the emergence of the evolution of human consciousness, which is my personal mission, the evolution of human consciousness is a collective work that is invested in by each of us on a daily basis. And when we think about evolutionary thinking, thinking outside of the general limiting beliefs that we hold, unity as a movement was built on ideas of multidimensional consciousness. Our founding writers, Charles Fillmore, E.V. Ingraham, wrote on multidimensional consciousness. If we can embrace multidimensional consciousness, we naturally grow into other points of view, other vantage points of reality, okay? And I want to share a quote from Talks on Truth by Charles Fillmore. He says that every form in the universe has within it a thought picture or pattern. The form may be destroyed, but the picture endures. Man's body is first a mental picture imprinted upon the ether or universal substance. When the body goes into dissolution, the picture remains and stimulates the consciousness of the 5 senses. He calls them 5 brothers in parentheses. If it has had no higher activity, again, when the body goes into dissolution, the picture remains and stimulates the consciousness of the 5 senses. If it has had no higher activity, it is this sense body shade that appears to the average psychic. Now, I want to note a number of things here. the template, the etheric grid that can be observed in certain types of photography now, what we have come to know and recognize in our science of today that will continue to evolve in this path of evolutionary thinking is that there is a grid on which our physical structure manifests. And this is the template, the picture that he's talking about held in mind, the divine blueprint of what our body consciousness incarnates, manifests into. And what I find very interesting in this expression of Charles Fillmore, when the body goes into dissolution, the image remains and stimulates the consciousness of the five senses if it has had no higher activity. That is the subtle mind teaching in Buddhism. And this brings me to our fourth pillar, which includes interfaith relations, the dialogue between multiple faiths, and the teachings of truth that resonate. There is a truth in Buddhism of a teaching of subtle mind awareness that when we engage in this experiential growth, this deep spiritual experience of truth, that we gain an awareness of subtle mind beyond the sense consciousness body, the five aggregates, the five senses. And as we navigate the in-between life stages, that subtle mind awareness comes into play as we embody again into another incarnation. And now it is for each to decide what they believe in this evolutionary thinking, what teachings resonate, and you are encouraged to begin where you are. Start where you are. Feel and know what is alive in your own spirit embodied. And from here, we make a journey of evolving human consciousness through ministry together. So to recap, our five pillars: the Fillmores, integral ministry, experiential growth, inclusivity, diversity, equity, accessibility, and 5, evolutionary thinking. The evolution of human consciousness in the Christ mind blueprint. We, as Unity Center of Illumination, are excited, we're blessed, we're fortunate, we're thrilled to be a healing ministry built on prayer, to come together in these shared values and the depth of what spiritual practice means to us, and bring this upon the 5 pillars of unity so that it is accessible to the world. Just as the Fillmores built the movement, the Society of Silent Unity, Unity School of Christianity, the Correspondence School, what we know as unity today in our world, practical Christianity, embracing an interfaith dialogue. Thank you for joining me for this talk on the 5 pillars, how they uphold our evolving community ministry through the lens of the Fillmores and through the lens of the relevancy in our ministry today. God bless you. Go in peace.